Good evening. We are indeed happy to have each of you here with us this evening. And we are in the penultimate lesson when it comes to the miracles tonight. And then we'll talk one more next week, and that'll be it. So we've almost made it to the very end. I think I've asked some of the questions every night we've been together, and some of them maybe just a time or two. So hopefully you know some answers to some of the questions and have gleaned something good from it along the way here as well. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Ear of Malchus, probably one that we're familiar with. This is one of the miracles that we find in all four of the scriptures in some form. Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, and John 18. And if you're familiar with the size of those books, you'll notice that all of those chapters are pretty much the last or two chapters at the end of each of those books. And that's because this is one of the very last things that we'll see with John. We're going to focus with Jesus, excuse me. I'm looking at the word John right here. We're going to focus in the book of Matthew tonight. So if you would be turning to Matthew 26, and we'll be there in just a moment. But we will also take a minute and look at both John and be in Mark any this evening, but you can find there as well. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you have ever had an earache? All right. I have tried to, but when I was little, I had earaches all the time. And I just remember it hurting a lot when I was little. And I think on 3 different occasions, I had tubes put into my ears to try and get it remedied. One time I got a basketball after getting the tubes put in my ears. So that was pretty neat. Like it was, I could put you to sleep. You wake up with a basketball. There's nothing wrong with that. But I just remember it really hurt. Well, I don't know. That's. Well, if any of y'all know anything about Lucille, you want to trust all of her knowledge of doctors because she goes, once a week or whatever. Or maybe it's once every 50 years when she goes, she can report back. But I do remember when I was young and that ear would be hurting so bad. And you'd lay on a heat pad or you try to, just take your hand and just stick it in almost just to make it stop hurting. And in this story of the Ear of Malchus, where they cuts his ear off, there were times when mine hurt so bad when I was little that it would have felt better if it was just gone. That's how bad it was. Unfortunately, I guess I aged out of it, or the 3rd round of tubes helped. I don't know. But I don't really have those kind of problems anymore. And I hate that anybody that does, I hate that for them. But we use our ears quite often. And so I wanted to think for a minute before we got into anything. Think about how we use our ears. How often you use your ears. And then maybe as we get older, our ears don't work quite as well as they once did. Some of us, they may work well, but we don't use them the way we're supposed to because we don't listen as much as we talk. I'm guilty of that quite often as well. But that's something on both sides of our head that obviously we would not want to lose. And we're going to see tonight this story of this guy losing his ear and Jesus performing a miracle and putting it back on. But I want us to remember tonight that this story is taking place, just like we talked last week, right in the midst of Jesus's last days on earth. And we talked last week about Jesus sort of approaching that tree and the fig tree and being frustrated and upset and how he reacted to it. And I want you to think about how might you react to some of the situations that Jesus faces tonight. Because in some ways, there's a difference in Jesus from last week to this week. Let's talk a little bit, though, about where we are in this to start with. This miracle takes place in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night Jesus had been betrayed by Judas. And that would have been a frustrating and disappointing situation. Somebody that you had been close to, even if you even suspected that was the case. Somebody that you, the way we would relate to it, maybe somebody you worked with for 3 years, and then they, betray you, they sell you out, whatever the word you might want to use there. And after Jesus and his disciples celebrate the Passover feast, you can see there on the screen, they leave the city of Jerusalem. They passed over the Kidron River to the Garden of Gethsemane. Well, the Kidron River is, I'm using the word river very, very loosely, but it originated north of the city of Jerusalem and went through split the Temple Mount and the Mount of Olives. And the Mount of Olives will be where our focus will be here this evening. But the Garden of Gethsemane is a real place. And I mean that not in the sense that it never was, but even today, it's still sort of viewed as a real place. It means the place, rough translation, place of oil presses, and it's a plot of ground enclosed by a stone wall, and as you can see there, that contained a grove of olive trees. And the garden was about half a mile, just not far at all, from the city, located on the western slope of the Mount of Olives. From the things that I've read, there are other places that have sort of claimed that where the Garden of Gethsemane was, but nonetheless, Jesus is not far out of town where this will take place. And when Jesus is here, like we said, we talked a little bit about this here, a little info here, but he goes to the garden, and the title of the painting that's up there is the title that I've used here, which is Agony in the Garden. And I would describe some of the times that my ear hurt as being in agony. And I'm guessing most of us have had some physical pain at some point that we would borderline describe as agony, right? Some kind of ailment, some kind of health issues, or whatever. That's not really the agony here, though. What kind of agony might Jesus have been facing at this time? Agony of the Spirit. Explain that, Ben. What do you mean by that?
He's known his whole life what's coming. And now he's at the eve of it. He knows the scourging, the crucifixion is coming, and the pressure is going to be put on his shoulders, human shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
And he's struggling with having to go through this and that. And can I endure it? Can I make it? Can I do my Father's will? And all this sin is going to be heaped upon him and going down to Hades and all these things. He's looking at all this coming at him at 100 miles an hour, and he's just tearing him apart.
And often if we know we have to do something difficult a year from now, we can kind of put it out of mind, right? And maybe don't have to think about it too hard. I know it's coming, but I'm just not. But when it's a day or 2 or 3 days away, it gets a little bit more realistic. And he's in the garden, and you see he'll ask that the cup of suffering would pass from him. But he says, and a quote that we're all very familiar with from Luke 22, he says then, not my will, but thy will be done, right? All right. Now, this is our first time in this series of lessons where we've really mentioned Judas. We've mentioned some of the apostles, but we've not mentioned Judas very often. But we see Judas come into play today. And so Judas would have known the Garden of Gethsemane because we see Jesus go there. And so Judas then brings a band of soldiers to the garden. And we'll see that here this evening. What is a band of soldiers? Well, it would have referred to a cohort of Roman soldiers numbering 400 to 600 men. What I've read, though, in building up for this is there likely would not have been that many people brought into the Garden of Gethsemane, but rather there would have been probably somewhere around 100 soldiers. But nonetheless, if you bring 100 soldiers at this time, 100 police officers today to arrest someone, what are you anticipating if you bring that many people? You're anticipating trouble, right? You're anticipating a potential problem. Most arrests, you might have 2 or maybe 3 police officers that would be there. But in this case, they've brought 100 soldiers roughly to come in and arrest Jesus. Not only that, in addition to those soldiers, you've got Jewish officers from the chief priest and the Pharisees as well. So you've got this whole thing that's sort of coming together right here with Judas at the head of it. All right. Last thing before we get into our reading, our scripture stuff, then your picture here from Caravaggio sometime in the 17th century. Not really known if it's him. I don't know enough about art to tell you this, but there's things about this picture that look enough like other Caravaggio pictures that they made it. That's a little bit more than I can tell you. Jimmy can tell you more about that after church is over. If you want to check with him, he'll give you all the details you need. We're in Matthew chapter 26 this evening. Okay, Matthew 26. We're going to start with verses 47 and go down through 51. We'll spend most of our time in Matthew. There are a couple of things in the other books that we're going to jump over and find here as well. Let's look, though, Matthew 26, these 5 verses, 47 through 51. Boo, do you care to read these for us to start with? Now, if you're in Matthew chapter 26, you'll notice, you may already notice, it's a very long chapter. But if you look back prior to this, we've seen Jesus, as we talked about, praying in the garden. We've seen Jesus predicting Peter's denial. We've seen the institution of the Lord's Supper as a thing that would be an entity existing going forward as well. And so we've seen sort of all of this. Sometimes you hear people say we're going to put a bow on it. Well, it's almost like you're kind of putting a bow on everything here, but it's a lot of maybe high stress situations. And you can imagine people being involved in this, both Jesus and disciples of Jesus being in sort of this high stress situation as well. Have you ever been in a situation where maybe you weren't stressed, but you knew that people around you were in pretty high stress? That affects you, even if it really isn't involving you at all. And we'll see that just a little bit here as we go. Matthew 26, though, in verse 47. What weapons does it say in Matthew here that the multitudes had? Swords and clubs. And I don't know what you call a multitude, but I'm thinking a fairly large number of people. But if I see one person with a sword, I'm going to catch notice of that, right? I'm probably going to look at that and think, why does that guy have a sword? Why would this have a... Well, all these people have swords and clubs. We're potentially involved in a somewhat dangerous situation. A couple of verses later, verses 48 and 49, what would be the sign of Judas's betrayal? How many of you knew that answer before I even asked it, right? That's probably one that we already knew. But there had to be some kind of recognition, some kind of trigger, as it were, to try and show who this person was. Now, let's dive into that for just a second. Jesus has been prominent in the area for about 3 years. But even still, Judas says that it would be whoever I kiss that you would know. So let's think about the appearance of Jesus with that information. What would Jesus perhaps have looked like if Judas felt the need to say, I'm going to have to give this guy, a kiss for you to know who it was? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Think so? Ben?
I will say that Thomas and him looked alike, so he would look just like everybody else, and maybe it would have been easily mixed up with other Thomas.
Absolutely. And so I think when they say this, you want to be really clear who it is, right? You want to be really clear who that person is. And so that's going to be sort of the trigger there that would show that the sign, I guess we'd say, of the betrayal. Uh-huh. Yep. The first question also talks about there being a multitude. I mean, this was quite often we've seen with Jesus, there's lots of people in and around him. There's lots of people involved in this group. it would be easy in that sense to sort of disappear there as well. But we see Jesus being seized because of this. Verse 49, Judas goes up to Jesus and says what? He says, "Greetings, Rabbi," and then kissed him. That's a hard verse to read there, isn't it? I've told a lot of people greetings, maybe not greetings. I don't know if I ever said that or not. Hello or whatever, but most of the time when I say hello or when I say hi or greetings, if you want to use that word, I'm excited, not selling you out for, you're potentially going to be taken away and killed right after that. Verse 50 and 51. After Jesus was seized, what occurred? I want to look at a couple things. I didn't ask that question real good. How does Jesus respond to what Judas did? Let's look at the start of verse 50. How does Jesus respond to what Judas did? Friend, why have you come? Right? Friend, why have you come? That's an interesting choice of words there, right? It might be just as interesting as the choice of greeting there on the front side. Do you think Jesus is aware of what's happening here? Now, this is why I said I wanted to think back to last week, because we see Jesus approach the fig tree last week with a level of sort of frustration, right? I think he responds a little differently here, right? In a situation where I think I would have almost grabbed Judas and wanted to just punch him in the face right there for but he says almost the hurt you can read in that handful of verses, right? Friend, why have you come? Yeah. It's
I think too, Daniel, verse 46, rise, let us be gone, see not the traitors of me.
Yeah.
Back up a few verses.
Right.
Jesus, it's time to go.
Right.
Jesus knew what was coming and he was ready to go.
So they seize him, and then in verse 51, what do they do with him? Or maybe I should say, what do they do? What happens after they seize him? Is it a smooth, everybody's, walks off, they're good? Look at verse 51. Seems like there would be sort of a scuffle. What ends up happening in this scuffle, as it were? Yeah. So if we read verse 51, and suddenly one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand, and he drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. All happens sort of just like that. I don't know if I've ever told this story or not, but years ago, there's a girl whose room was 2 doors down from mine that I taught with. I've taught with her for years. She's not very big. And there was 2 kids that were kind of jawing outside in the hallway. And all of a sudden, they sort of were pushing. And all of a sudden, it was pretty much a fight. Well, I go and grab one of the boys, and another guy, he grabs the other one, and we pull it like this. And I look, and this girl is like, I was like, Liz, what are you doing? Like, move. You're just getting in the way right here. But sometimes things sort of get out of hand really quick. And we see here, I don't know if the plan was to cut the guy's ear off, but Peter did, right? Because it seemed like Jesus is being attacked. And so he responded pretty quick to this. We have to fix this, if as it were. But I would think, I don't know how long this took, but it seems like it all happens at a really quick pace. I think you're probably right? I think you are probably right with that. There's a more detailed version in John chapter 18 and verse 10. Maria, do you care to read that verse for us? So John gives us a little bit more of an in-depth. He gives names that Matthew didn't give. So who was the person who did this? Peter. And I think what Ben said is probably right. The sword is going, and wherever it strikes, we're aiming for the head, and we'll see how this takes place. Does this seem to fit the character that we've established of Peter over the years? Probably so. We've seen a rather urgent actor that Peter quite often would be. What ear was it? I don't know if that really matters or not, but it was the right ear. And what was the name of the guy? That's kind of tough, right? Showed up to rest and get your ear cut off. It would have been a pretty crazy thing. John's the only gospel to mention both Peter and Malchus by name here. So Think so? Think. Uh-huh. Marie, aren't you glad that she said, I'm not really going to act it out? Like, I don't know. I don't know if we got any Jesus abilities to heal on that right now. All right, let's go a little further. Let's go ahead. Yeah, and we've seen a little bit of that going on as well. Uh-huh.
Before, when Jesus is explaining to them all plainly what happened, they said, no, pulls it away by hand. You're not doing this.
Right.
And Jesus rebukes him, but we see here Peter still isn't willing to accept Jesus.
So maybe in that sense, our sort of inherent traits are sometimes hard to suppress, right? They're hard to remove. Luke 22 and verse 51. Jill, do you care to read this one just up on the screen here? And so we see in Luke, we've not seen the touch the ear and heal him. I've put up there the thoughts from a physician. Although it appears in four gospels, Luke alone mentions that Jesus did what? That he heals the ear, right? That he healed the ear. Now, Luke is a physician, a doctor in our term we might would use. Why would maybe Luke would mention this when the others did not? This is the kind of thing that the doctor looks for. I don't know. I feel like I would have told this if I had seen it. But, everybody tells the story perhaps a different way. But Jesus answered and said, permit even this. Right? And so even the people that are arresting him, he's looking out maybe for their best interest, for their health, as it were. Yeah.
I've always thought if I would have been there and seen Jesus put that ear back up perfectly, I would have become a believer at that point. I just wouldn't.
Be hard not to.
Even the high priest, I'd have said, wait, this don't normally happen.
And Luke, John and Mark being there, and then John and Matthew being there, and Mark getting stories from Peter more like Luke kind of takes his account from everybody. I'd say Luke is probably the one that's not seen this guy as the enemy, that the rest of them seen.
Right.
Been there.
Sure. Sure. Now, we've not really seen a whole lot of red writing on the board so far, or on the screen on the board. The teacher comes out still on the screen. We've not really, all of this action in Matthew especially is sort of happening without Jesus, or at least without Jesus talking, I should say. But we're going to see here in these last handful of verses, 52 through 56, that Jesus will have a say in what takes place right here. So let's look at these verses here, 26, 52 through 56. Mom, you want to read those?
But all this was done that the scriptures and the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples forsook him and fled.
How do you interpret Jesus's mood in these verses? Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Other thoughts? How would you interpret the mood of Jesus? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
The other gospel, what it says, they asked Jesus who is he like, and it says they fell back and fell down like this.
Mm-hmm.
I think Jesus is kind of letting know, I'm ready to take him. You're not.
Right. We'll see that here in just a little bit as well. Yeah, go ahead.
I think he was the most confident person, like a football team that wins a game or an army that's storming.
Mhm.
Well, it's thousands and thousands of them got killed. But they knew this was, Jesus knows now at this point. He's already praying and he's begging and he's pleading with his Father. But he's come to the point. I know I can do this.
So that's what
He's calm now. He's calm.
that's what I wanted to address at the beginning from last week to this week, where there seems like a level of anxiety and a level of frustration with Jesus when he comes on the fig tree and whatever. But now Jesus seems to be more comfortable in his place. Peter doesn't seem to be too comfortable. Some others probably aren't too comfortable, but Jesus does seem to be. What did he see? And this is from Matthew 26, verse 52. What did Jesus tell the disciple with the sword? Put it up, right? He says to put your sword in your place. Then not just tells him to put it up, but then also sort of throws a little extra on there too. What is the follow-up to that, telling him to put it away? What does that sentence mean there? You're not going to fix this by killing the arrestee, right? Because then what are they going to do? And they're going to come back. And then you got to kill more. This has to happen. And we're not going to help anybody by just swiping swords, hitting each other, killing each other right and left. And so Jesus then goes a little further. If we go a little further in verse 53, he said, or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? So this is kind of what Ben said there just a moment ago, but Jesus says, your sword might cut an ear off, or it might kill a man or two, but what did Jesus have, according to his own words here, the power to do? He can stop it at any time, and they'll all be gone, right? They would all be gone. Like, I might be able to, kill a man or two with the sword, but it's going to come for me really quickly. But Jesus says, I have the power to call on who? Heavenly Father, to call on God, then it'd be able to fix it. But then in verse 54, if Jesus had been helped by angels, which he could have done, what would not be accomplished? Say it again. It would not be fulfilled. They would not accomplish what they needed to be accomplished. There are times when kids at school will ask me a question about something. We're researching something or we're looking something up, and they'll say, what's the answer to number 10? Whatever, just making something up. Well, they want me to say the answer is this. Because if I say the answer is this, then it's fixed, right? But I tell them, all right, we're going to look in here, and I might narrow it down and say, here's some sources, here's some resources we're going to look at, but I want them to find it, all right? My thought being here that they need to kind of do this themselves. Well, God can swoop in and just eliminate everybody, but if that's the case, if he comes in with the quote-unquote answer like I was using a second ago, then that doesn't accomplish, like Judy said, what was supposed to be accomplished. And there had to be that in order for this plan to play out the way it was supposed to. Thoughts on that? We got a couple more verses, but just thoughts on what Jesus says in verse 54. How then could the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen thus?
Well, I think that's why we put Jesus on the pedestal that we've seen that we put him on.
Mm-hmm.
He's rightfully on that pedestal. None of us, not one time we went through anything that Jesus went through, not even a snippet of it. We would have called, if I had 72,000 or more angels,
Mm-hmm.
and knowing full well that one angel killed 185,000 Syrians who were not I called, several of them would go. But that's why I'm not the same.
Right.
I could never be the same. Jesus was perfect. He was the same.
Let's look at verse 55 and 56. Because we've rarely seen Jesus in this miracle study. And I know we've not talked about everything Jesus did in his life, but we've rarely seen Jesus in this miracle study show any kind of violent tendencies, and we've not seen anything like that. So I want to look at verse 55 and 56 to wrap things up here this evening. Jesus said to the multitude, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? They are arresting Jesus the same way they would arrest the worst person in the world. I'm sure, and I'm no police officer, but I'm sure that there are discussions at the police office that when this person over here has to be arrested, we need to take several folks. And when this person over here, we can probably saunter over there and get them one person, and that'll take care of it. Jesus is saying, you have sent 100 people to arrest me. You've sent people with swords and with clubs. You've sent people to arrest me. But he said, I sat daily with you, teaching in the temple, and you did not seize me. I think Jesus knows a lot of the people that are arresting him. What do you think? At least maybe a passing familiarity with people that he's seen from one place or another. Because he said, I've been in all, at no point, we later see none of this was done in secret, but Jesus said, at no point have I been like hiding, right? I've been right there. You knew where I'd be. I'd be in the temple. I'd be there. Come and get me then. So why do you think they came the way they did instead of just arresting him in the temple, wherever, in a calm, peaceful way? Fear of the crowd. Yeah. Multitude following him, sure. 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 What else? Yeah.
Not just the crowd, but people that follow him, thought how they are, but also the Romans.
Sure.
Follow the right, and what's going on.
Sure. And so we see Jesus then be arrested. And this is, I said at the beginning, we have one more miracle. The last miracle that we'll see is actually sort of be after Jesus' resurrection, and we'll talk about that next week. But I just wanted us to get to this point. And we see where Jesus is. I've told you that our next series of lessons is going to deal with the last week of Jesus' life, and I think this will sort of mesh with that just a little bit. But I wanted us to see that this is how it ends in many ways for Jesus. His ability to conduct miracles will kind of end right here, in part because he's being arrested. I'm not saying he couldn't have. Who knows what did happen. But this is sort of the end of Jesus's appearances in the public forum, talking to people, preaching and teaching. And so we come to sum up maybe the last 3 years in the last 33 lessons. How would you describe Jesus's miracle work from lesson 1 to lesson 33?
It changed along the way. To start with, he could tell people not to tell anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the crowd grew, but also got controlled as it went along.
Mm-hmm.
They told because they needed the word spread around, but you covered some areas, you didn't cover every area, because people had to go and tell at that point. And I would say more people believed as it went along, because we saw more people, everyone was not.
Well, it could be anything. I'm asking for a summation really of anything. How would you, most of you have been in here for 33 weeks. How would you sum up Jesus's miracles? It's hard to ask.
I think that he was laying a foundation throughout his public ministry. He's laying the foundation. And then as the church came into existence, people started drawing them to that foundation. And then the church was built on the promises and the power and the glory of Jesus.
Sure. Go ahead, sir. Sure. Yes, sir.
And each miracle, when it happened, had a specific point to it,
Mm-hmm.
and that moved him closer to the crucifixion.
Absolutely. Each it was almost like a piece on a game board, right? Every move you got to make would go further. I had Jimmy read the scripture reading that he did for a reason. So I want you to flip back to Matthew chapter 5. Yeah, go ahead. Uh-huh. Absolutely. Absolutely. We've made that comment not every week, but quite often, that what was the purpose of this miracle or that miracle? And Connie, is exactly what you said right there, was to, that the scripture would be fulfilled. It's like you said, it was like to move to the next level, whatever it might would be. Leland? Uh-huh. Absolutely. Ben, what were you going to say?
I just wanted to say, yeah, they wasn't just willy-nilly, they was all planned out, marked out with a purpose. Like the blind man in the gospel said, who sinned him or his parents?
Yeah.
Nobody sinned, this was happening so that God could receive glory, so that Jesus could receive glory. All these things that these people suffered wasn't suffered for nothing.
Right.
For a purpose and for a reason. That reason was glorified.
Matthew chapter 5 and verse 44. And this is right in the midst of the Sermon on the Mount, but essentially Jesus' first real preaching and teaching effort. He said, "But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you." In a sense, on opening day, Jesus was saying what he said at the end. Because what happens in Matthew chapter 26, verse 44 of Matthew chapter 5, were there enemies involved? Did he bless them? He absolutely did. Did he do good to those that hated him? There's a guy with an ear that would definitely say so. Did he pray for those who spitefully just did it? Like we said a minute, they could have arrested him any time, but they kind of came and did it at the time that they did, spitefully used and persecuted them. So Jesus' story, and I think I've said this before, but it didn't really change from the first day to the last day. His character stayed the same. A few things to go home with, and I think we've hinted on it there a little bit here tonight. Number one, Jesus' mercy and love never ceases, right? Even in the face of betrayal, aggression, arrest, how did Jesus handle himself? He handled himself with love and mercy. Jesus was under threat, and his immediate reaction was to do what to the guy who'd had his ear cut off? Healed. I think, like many of you, I probably would have looked at that and said, well, that's one less that maybe he's going to hurt, but that was not his immediate reaction. So a reminder to us that no matter how hurt we are at times, right? No matter how betrayed we can be at times, that we would maybe want to align our actions with the same that Jesus did. 2, we have to seek peace and forgiveness, right? We said just a minute ago that in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus taught the people that were listening to him to turn the other cheek, right? He told them to bear wrongs patiently. He taught them to forgive without limit. And then he did it with Malchus. We have to seek out peace and forgiveness in those tense situations as well. And finally, Jesus knew what was going to happen. Even still, he demonstrated that same commitment at the end that he did at the beginning. He said, he even mentions, God could fix this, but that's not part of God's will for him. And he said his task had to be to go through this. And for us, we're not asked to do anything like this, but when the challenges that we face in life come upon us, and they do in whatever form they might be, we too have to bear those consequences as well. Because the reward for us is a home in heaven, right? But the home in heaven is available because Jesus obeyed God's will also. Everybody has to hold up their end of the deal. If there's anything that we can do for you, we extend these invitations each time. Whatever we can do to help, we invite you to come while we stand and sing.